Awesome.
All righty. So first of all, welcome everybody. This is our second in a series of CTO to CTO discussions. With me, I have Alex, our CTO at Svetla, and we're going to go through four main topics today. We're going to try our best to stay within the hour and make sure, I know everybody's got lunch or something going on, but I want to make sure that we are able to cover as much as possible as well. The last few minutes, obviously, we can leave that for questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free throughout. Just drop it in the chat. Eeyore is helping us capture all those questions so we have them lined up for the end. But with that, I want to quickly start. Just Alex, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Alex. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Svetla Systems. I've been here for about 1.5 years, and prior to that, I've had several CTO positions and CTO roles. And prior to that, I worked for very large organizations like IBM and Verizon and ADT and those kinds of big companies. And I held executive technology positions at those companies, managing many people on various large enterprise projects. And with that, hand it back to you, Johan.
So my introduction starts with Alex was my boss at one point, and over the years we've collaborated, we've worked together on several projects, and my focus has shifted from software development enterprise into more AI and data science. But background software development, working same as Alex with big, large companies, and helping them get AI into production. So with that, our first topic we're going to discuss is going to be around just, I went to school as a data scientist. So when I came out of school, it was one of those things where I just want to do modeling. I don't want to care about getting into production, all that stuff, because that's not the fun part. However, what we see these days is if your team is just doing research, if they look like a research team, you're not very likely going to ship a lot of product. You might, but that's not going to be the core focus. The core focus is going to be research. So if we think about AI is not a model problem, AI is a systems problem. That kind of sets the stage how we think about these, life cycle ownership, where it's end-to-end machine learning engineers and things like that. So Alex, I have a question for you about that. When you're approaching projects, right, from that CTO view and lens, obviously you're looking at it at much larger than just the AI solution or the data science solution. So tell me a little bit about, how do you go about setting these teams up for success, having the right people involved, making sure that you have all the skill sets and not just a very cool AI demo?
Yeah, great question. So, one thing that I want to mention is that AI doesn't replace engineering. I think I'm looking at it more from that it expands engineering capabilities. So, a lot of organizations think that AI is just another feature that you tack on to some kind of a product or a service. And that's not really how it plays out in reality, as everyone is now coming to realize. And once you introduce AI, it starts influencing how your entire system behaves, right? From data flows to decision making to even the user experience, right? So everything starts to morph around how AI is implemented in this. And it's not really isolated anymore. It becomes part of the architecture. It becomes part of most of the systems that are created. And it's like a tentacle that starts to go everywhere. So what you're really doing isn't replacing engineering. You're kind of expanding the scope in a pretty significant way. So you have to look at that first before you start to, think about what else you want to do and how to prepare the team to build some of these systems. The other thing is, a lot of people have been introduced over the last year or so into the prompting type of engineering. And it's, prompt engineering, I've actually seen some job posts out there, looking for a prompt engineer. It's not really a role, in my opinion. I think it's more of a capability, right?
Mm-hmm.
In my opinion, there's been a lot of hype around this prompt engineering stuff, but in practice, it behaves more like an API design rather than some kind of a standalone job, right? You have to structure your input, you have to structure output, But the most important thing is that it produces reliable results. And that naturally belongs inside of the engineering and product team, not as like a separate function. And
Yeah.
when teams, kind of treat all that as a shared capability, the quality of the system improves in a good significant way. So hope I answered your question.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I would say most of the projects I work on, they're focused on AI and they have adjacent pieces where they're integrating with backend or mobile or whatever. But
Mhm.
there's a couple of new roles that kind of revealed itself over the last, I want to say, 10 years. People think it's only the last 5 or 6 years, but it's been a little longer. So the first one would be that AI project manager, or sorry, product manager role that basically the difference is they need to define value and risk. If you don't have that role defined, what happens very often with these projects is that it overruns on budget, very likely today on token cost that somebody didn't take into account. But then you also have the implementation people, the machine learning, the Gen AI engineer. They're the ones that builds the logic layer, the RAG, the prompts. So
Mhm.
prompts is a piece of
Yep.
that, but it's not a role by itself, like you said. The evaluation, all of those things is what we're looking for when we interview and when we recruit for that Gen AI role. But then you also have another layer. And a lot of times with our clients, this is where we become a partner and we kind of train their existing DevOps people to learn about ML ops, right? Machine learning ops. Um, what
Yep.
that gives them is repeatability. It gives that ML ops role is really what makes things repeatable as far as deployments, testing, integration testing, all those things. And then the last role that I would think is really core to that new stack is just the SRE or the security folks, right? They're the
Yep.
ones that's thinking about governance and safety and guardrails. You're dealing with intelligence here. It's not just deploying some kind of code into a Docker container. There's some
Right.
things that it's going to do that you didn't expect because there's some intelligence involved. So
Right.
those, say, are some of the new roles. And just I want to hear what you're thinking, but I think there's really three rails that teams must operate in. First is going to be product, right? That's the business value, the UI, UX, that piece. But then you also have the platform. And a lot of times I think people are missing when they do proof of concepts and things, they forget about the platform because really what's sexy about it is the product, building something, a model. And then the last thing that almost nobody really wants to think about, they do, but they don't want to, is the risk auditing, monitoring, the governance of that project. So, I mean,
Yep.
what do you think? Does those three rails kind of capture that, or have you seen other areas as well?
No, I agree with you. From an AI product manager, product thinker, whatever you want to, term that particular position, it is, in my opinion, one of the most important roles that is emerging, if it
Mm,
hasn't already, caught on over there. But in my opinion, it's even more critical because that person needs to decide where, as you mentioned regarding value, where does AI provide value in
mm,
an organization? Just because AI is out there, just because a lot of companies are embracing it, does not necessarily mean that every single company can benefit from it. There are some companies that don't need AI, although some companies could greatly benefit from it. So not everything should be AI driven, and in some cases it probably may introduce even more risk than the benefit. But that judgment requires both the product intuition as well as technical understanding. And when you get that role right, it has some really massive impacts on the success of the system. Now, you mentioned security. Yeah, AI does introduce risks, right? That traditional systems have never had to deal with. And you got to think about, prompt injection. You have to think about data leakage. You have to think about all kinds of other things that you didn't have to think about before. And
mm,
if you're using a third party model, some kind of LLM that you're not building in house or training in house, um, you know, you might be exposing unintentionally sensitive information out there. And once that sensitive detail goes out, you know, you lose control over what's going to happen with it. So
yeah.
security, I think, becomes very more, much more important, and it requires discipline to figure out how to deal with it. So yeah, I totally agree with your comments on those.
So the one thing I want to emphasize, and you touched on it, and it kind of reminds me, is that this is another kind of lesson learned, right? The hard way is that technical debt grows faster when you introduce machine learning systems than traditional software. And
Yeah,
we see this all the time, with people. I don't want to say it's just vibe coding, but it's so easy to very quickly now develop tools and processes and pipelines and stuff like that, that if you don't have good governance, that technical data is going to grow much faster than before. And we've seen this actually now. And you and I mean, we've had this discussion with people coming to us and saying, you know what, we thought we are going to lay off 5 team members and just have 3 people that's going to vibe code and get this going. And 6 months later, we need to go hire some people to fix the code
right.
because we've created 6 months of technical
Later.
debt.
Oh yeah.
So that kind of it kind of leads me into one of the next topics I wanted to discuss, which is at what point when you're building your team, if you're a company thinking about moving into the future into using AI, at what point do you hire people on staff that's experts that knows how to do it? They have the best practices nailed versus partner with a company that's got those expertise and stuff, but you don't necessarily have to incur the
Yeah.
cost and onboarding and stuff. Do you have a good sense how to make that differentiation? If
Yeah,
we're sitting.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So I speak with our clients all the time, and they're coming to us and helping us and wanting our help. And they're asking, hey, we need to hire this AI engineer, and it's super important. And what I sometimes see, not all the time, but in some cases, I see that a bunch of companies rush to hire some of this AI talent that's out there, and
Yeah,
they're doing this before they even know what they're going to be building. And
yeah.
the result is usually that they hire some really awesome people, because we find them, or we take them off of an existing project and we reallocate them to a new client or whatnot. So they're getting some really awesome people, but then
Mhm.
they have no direction as to what they're going to be building, right? and
Yeah.
and as you and I both know, we've managed lots of engineers in our career, and even awesome engineers struggle without some kind of a well-defined problem. So my thought is that timing the hiring decisions correctly is just as important as who you hire. So I don't want to see companies rush to do this kind of stuff. They really need to think about what they're going to be building. How is it going to
Mhm.
be used? Is it really going to be necessary? In fact, I spoke to a gentleman yesterday um, who has engaged with us to do some engineering work, and one of the capabilities of the tool is some AI work, but we still don't know. Do we need to hire 10 AI engineers to be able to implement that capability, or do we just need one person who's really good to be able to do it? We don't know yet, so we have to do some discovery and so on and so on. But I've seen a lot of this stuff happening where people hire a bunch of people, and they're just going to sit around and not really know what they need to be doing. So
The,
that's
the I those are all good points. The way that I see it, I'll use an example to kind of start that thought. Years ago, I worked for this company I won't mention, and I've been tracking along, just how they're doing because they're in my backyard. They're one of the bigger companies around here, and I saw suddenly they started hiring, and they had like 10 open data science positions.
mhm,
So I still know people that work there from when I was there. And I ask, are you guys like, what's happening? Because it's unexpected. You're investing so much time and money and effort into resources. And they're like, yeah, no, we're fully going, embracing AI. We set up Snowflake and we're good to go and all that. I'm like, okay, great. About 3 months later, I met one of the guys for coffee, and I'm like, so how's that going? I saw, did you guys fill all the positions? Because hiring 10 data scientists a couple of years ago was not that easy. Everybody, demand was high, but not a lot of people with the right skill set. And they're like, well, we hired a few of them and they all left already. I'm like, that's
mm,
interesting.
wow,
So
okay,
the thing is, I mean, if you think about it, when you don't know about an area, you might have higher expectations just because you don't know. But let's make
right,
it simple. Let's say, for instance, I want to redesign the brand for Nike, right? There's iconic, the logo, all of that. I can get the best designer that can go into Photoshop and Adobe, use all the tools and stuff, and they might have a really good eye to implement it, but they might not have the strategy. They might not have the leadership to, because one person alone is not going to build a brand for Nike. It's requiring a team. So my point is, it's easy to kind of use that as an example because the expectations people have, they know designers are really good at what they're doing, but it's a different skill set to build the brand for a company. It's not just a logo design. It's much more
Right.
than that. And it's the
Right.
same when you build AI projects. It's the same if you build software development projects, right? If
Mhm.
you have a CTO that's running the company organization with strategy and all that stuff, that is their job. Their job is not going coding the curly brackets and stuff, unless you're in a startup. It's
Right.
the same with the engineer. If you hire a bunch of engineers, you can't expect them to fill that leadership role. And a lot of times I see that is where the problem is when people are like, you know what, we want to start with AI. Let's go hire a bunch of machine learning engineers. That's great. But who's going
Mhm.
to lead them? That's the question that you have to ask. So
Right.
what I typically do is I like, you know me now, I like having lists and rules so I can, rule of thumbs. It's not hard set rules, but I like to think of it like this. When the model that I like to use is you start by partnering and you do a proof of concept, and then you can make a decision because you've at that point you've done a couple of things. One, you've tested if the ideas you have are the right ideas. You mentioned this earlier, Alex. Not every company needs to use AI for everything, right? So a proof of concept is really proving out: do we really need to use AI for this? Also, if you have an internal team, it gives them a little bit of muscle memory to see how to execute on those projects. You know, it's a proof of concept, low risk, but they learn what's the nuances with machine learning and AI versus software development. So it gives them that exposure. And then from there, you can scale it to an MVP and a beta rollout. So you have small deliverables and you actually have something that you can build on versus let's just throw people on a problem and hope for the best. You know, that to me
That's
is
right.
never a good plan.
That's right. That's right. And the other thing is that there's a big difference between developing a prototype or an MVP and a production system. And
Yeah,
this is where, in my opinion, this is where partners like the ones that we work for, Sweetla, they're especially helpful in bridging that gap because we can establish the right architecture, the right patterns for development very early on in the process. We've done this before. We've done this hundreds of times before. Our clients haven't, right? This is the first time they're delving into this AI world. So we don't want them to experiment. The more they experiment, the the more knowledge they get, but they're also wasting a lot of time and a lot of money. So
yeah,
if we do things for them, if they engage with us from a from a consulting perspective, it prevents rework later, and it saves a lot of
mm,
time, a lot of effort, a lot of frustration. So it's not about
yeah,
the speed, but it's about building something that will last a very long time. The other thing
yeah,
is, I think that once AI does become a a not codependence, but a core part of the product offering, the ownership of who owns that IP starts to matter, right? A lot more. You don't want
yes,
your partner to own the IP.
yeah,
We never own the IP that we develop for our clients. Our clients own everything, but you want the internal teams of a company to deeply understand the models, the data, the workflows, everything, and that's where the long-term value becomes quite important.
yeah,
So we can help them, we can get them going, but ultimately they need to take it and run with it, so that they can continue to scale it, and we can help them support the product. We can help them do all those other things, but building that internal team is super important.
So the one thing I want to add to that, and I think those points definitely leads into one of the core philosophies that we have is that, and this is something that I've done throughout, just how I've built AI models and projects and things like that, is we're not we're not in an academic environment. So doing experiments that has no clear outcome except maybe writing a paper because you discovered something new, that's not an option. If you're, Google or your OpenAI or that's what you do for a living, different story. But most businesses are in the business of making a pencil or shipping this or building some, not AI. Very few companies really do these AI models, and that's a different approach. So when you think about it, I would not scale a team before I know there's an ROI attached to the
Right.
project.
Agreed.
That to me is
100%.
super. And it's just one of those fundamental principles that it seems like people forget about it because they're like, it's something new. Let's test it out and learn about it. And the problem is, you can do that, like you mentioned, but it's expensive. If you learn, and I'll give you an example. We had a client, and I think I can't remember if you were on the call with me, Alex, but they had super smart engineer that came over the weekend, built, vibe coded a project for them, and it looked really promising. Did a great job building the application and getting it working, actually getting it into Azure. The challenge that they faced, why they came to us, is like, all right, we don't really know how to scale this thing because as it is right now, if we just put it into production, the token cost alone is like $25,000 a month.
Mhm.
And they're like, so we proved it works, but we didn't
Mhm.
use the right tools. We didn't think upfront about the scaling
Yeah.
and all those things. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, it's not a problem about engineering. It's a
Right.
problem about defining the problem and picking the right solution.
Correct.
Nobody really thought about what's the ROI that we need to prove out here in the beginning so that they can
Right.
evaluate the cost.
Right.
So there's a lot of things AI can do, but
Sure.
you're willing to pay for it. And then the other thing, just I'm going to throw in a little bit of data science, machine learning expertise here.
Yep.
Language models are great at doing a lot of things. They're very good at generalizing and doing things. If you go and analyze behind the scenes what Claude and OpenAI and all these tools do, the language model very often is just orchestration. It doesn't actually do the calculations, the predictions, the image generation. Those are other models. Those are other tools. When people build agents or language model products, very often they'll use the language model for everything. And it's expensive,
Very
it's
expensive.
slow, it's not very accurate in a lot of cases. So it's not the right tool. And that is why when you build these things, having a partner come in and help you in the beginning how to think about these problems is super important, I think. Once you establish the ROI, once you have the muscle memory for your team, or you've hired the right people, then owning it is important. um, One of the things, like when we talk to startups, for instance, is they very often have a core idea. That's why they're a startup, and they want to own that IP. And you touched on that as well. So I want to just tie that. Um, a rule of thumb again for that is if it's tied to a core differentiation between you and your competitors, own
Yep.
it. Own it. Absolutely. You can still do a proof of concept, but you want to very quickly hire or onboard people that can own that core IP. However, nobody accepted. I actually have some friends that's in that industry, but for the most part, nobody owns or differentiates themselves with ML ops. That's where you
Right.
partner. So
Right.
the model you own, ML ops, Azure, AWS certifications, all those things, go to a partner to help you with that. So
Right.
that is kind of how I look at that hire versus partner, how you want to differentiate from that CTO level.
Yep.
What,
I agree. Yeah. I agree.
any,
For sure.
no,
What's that? I'm sorry.
any pushback? No
Oh, no, no, no.
disagree?
No, no,
No. Okay.
nope. Not
All
on
right.
that.
I would love feedback from the audience if there's anybody that has a different take on that. But I
Yeah.
think that is something everybody is dealing with, trying to figure out. So again, in 6 months, we might have a different opinion. But what
Right.
I've seen at least over the last year or two, that pretty much those rules are what applies.
Yep.
All right. So I want to kind of, we started leaning towards the tech stack and things like that. Because again, when you partner with somebody, we're AWS partners, we're Azure partners, GCP, all those. We actually, Alex, what is one of our guys just got a new certification, right?
He did. Yes. So we have an employee of ours who is, he went through the process of getting certified in every single AWS certification that they have. They have over 100 certifications, and there are, I think, around 200 people in the whole world that actually went to AWS and were certified in everything that AWS has to offer. And once you get all of those certifications, you get this thing called a golden jacket, I need to ask him if he can send a picture of him wearing this golden
Yeah.
jacket. But yeah, so he has all of those AWS certifications. There are over 100 of them. So yeah, we
Hmm.
have one of those folks on our end, and we bring people like that to the table when one of our clients, has a question about, hey, we're thinking about going to AWS, we're thinking about
Hmm.
going to Microsoft Azure. Could you tell us which one is better? You know,
Yeah.
there's no real reason to go to one versus the other, especially if the client already has an
Mm.
account with one of those vendors, right? I don't want to get into the philosophical or religious debate over who's better, who's not. AWS clearly was at the lead for many, many years. I know Microsoft has caught up. Of course, Azure keeps on developing new stuff, and Google is rounding out the third spot right now, right? But
Yeah.
if all of those already have the basic stuff, they have the identities, they have the networking, they have security, they have deployment pipelines, all those things are already there in all of them, so you don't have to worry about that stuff. So
Mm.
the question is, is reinventing the stack too early in the process? Is that an unnecessary complexity that clients just love to do? No, I don't
Yeah.
think they should. So unless there's a really specific reason, staying within the ecosystem that they already have, whether it's Azure or AWS, you already have the account. Use it. See what it can do for you. If there's a really good reason to switch to some other one, do so, but don't just blindly say, "Oh, well, I heard AWS is really awesome, so let's just go with that." Well, yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, maybe somebody told them because they were, an AWS salesperson or something.
Yeah.
Um, so I wouldn't, I would start with the existing cloud environment that they already have, unless there's a
Mhm.
really strong reason not to pursue it. So that's the way
Okay.
I think
So
about
basically there's two. I'm gonna move it even a level up. There's kind of two modes to operate in for companies, right? One is the embedded uh, architecture where you're with AWS or you're with Azure or GCP or whatever, right? So you're relying on speed to market because you're offloading a lot of the maintenance, and the setup and all that into a service layer. But there's a cost involved. We've seen this. It used to be cheaper to go to the cloud, and it's starting to kind of get a little different, right?
it. Yep.
Then you have another model. It's not cloud versus on-prem. It's more cloud, and then it's the separate or the portable model. And what I
Yep.
mean with that is we see this a lot where companies will say, you know what, we're an Azure shop, but we want to use Snowflake for
Hmm.
our database. We don't want to use whatever data lake or anything with Azure services.
Hmm.
Or it could be that they're running agentic workflows and like everything runs in Azure except all our models run in Rock or whatever. So
Hmm.
we're starting to see more of that hybrid model where it's a little bit more portable and it's not just in single areas. And there's decision points, right? So there's reasons why people would do that. When you think about having separate stack, it gives you maximum flexibility. A lot of times better cost control at scale because you're able to find cheaper versus just pay whatever these the whole system gives you. But there's a problem with that. You require a really strong platform team because now you're managing across different infrastructures and security layers and stuff
Yes.
like that. So
Correct.
it really a payoff, if you're looking for that. So I agree with you. I think just getting things up and running and testing it, stick to what you have. The people that you have, the knowledge that they have, built on that until there's a really good reason. Just like before the ROI, go and invest in that. And the last thing I'll say there, and I want to hear what you think is what I'm seeing, and I'm again, rule of thumb, most companies end up with about, I want to say 80% of their models that they use are managed, meaning they're using from Azure or they're using it from Bedrock or OpenAI or whatever it's going to be, right?
Hmm.
And then I would say that 20% that's left is where they have custom self-hosted models, for like edge cases or very business specific cases. Given that, just knowing that as again, just it's anecdotal, right? But we see a lot of companies.
We do.
It just kind of makes sense to first test within the existing infrastructure. Don't go and spend all the money on creating your own models and things like that unless you have a really good reason to, and you can attach that ROI.
Yep. Yeah. So two things I wanted to respond with.
Yeah.
Speaking of, the specific models, we have actually a client who needs to use a specific model. I don't want to say too much about what it is because we have an NDA in place, but they have a specific model that, based on the contracts that this client has signed with their vendors, that model cannot be in the cloud. It must be on-prem, and that model has to be able to do some document recognition. It has to do some other things. So we're helping them build out an on-prem LLM using GPUs and all the other things that need to be done. But that has to run on-prem and cannot be connected to the cloud in any way. So an interesting perspective there. Whereas
Yeah.
most of the other companies, like you mentioned, maybe it's 80/20, maybe it's 90/10. I don't know what the right mix is, but they are leveraging LLMs and other models that are managed by other companies or other products or whatever the case may be. The thing that you mentioned though before is regarding the right architecture. I just want to mention that I had another conversation with a different client the other day, and my recommendation to them was build out the system so that there's several layers within that architecture, and the specific model is not tied into the rest of the code base. Because if it is, and for whatever reason a different model comes out that's faster, better, cheaper, whatever, I mean, these models are coming out insanely quickly these days. So you don't want to rely on one particular model. You want to develop your code base so that you can swap out the model and the rest of the code continues to run. So because there's no single model that does everything well, right? We end up using different models for different tasks like classification or summarization or whatever the case may be. And if we do it so that you have different layers, um, and you are able to do it so that you don't talk directly to the model, it gives you better performance and ultimately it gives you more control. And it could be that cost is a factor because you're using this one model and all of a sudden your cost goes through the roof. So you want to perhaps swap it out with a different model, but you don't want to rewrite your entire code base just because you change out your model.
Right. So I do want to brag a little bit.
Yeah,
Um,
go
I'm,
ahead.
I'm expecting today a delivery for a on-prem server. It's actually a Dell. Um, it's the Dell Pro Max, the GB10, and it's got a Blackwell GPU from NVIDIA, which is like their supercomputer. They call it a
Right.
supercomputer. It's not really, but it can run uh, pretty large models. And with that, it's based on the Blackwell chip. I don't know if like maybe 3 weeks ago, NVIDIA had their big event and stuff, and they were talking about NemoClaw, which is the more robust, secure version of OpenClaw, which
Hmm.
has everybody's been taking the storm. So the reason I mentioned that, I'm bragging a little bit, I'm super excited about it, obviously, is
Yeah.
it's just one of those things where we have clients asking us, we are seeing all these open source projects and things like that. We don't want to, we hear about the security risks. We don't want to open it up to the world, our data, our access, and things like that. Can we secure it? So the reason I'm getting this is I need to test and experiment and see so I can inform, and if somebody asks me a question, because more and more what you're talking about, clients are starting to think about on-prem, having portions of their infrastructure. And when I say on-prem, it could still be a data center. It's not,
Yeah, of
like
course.
back in the day when you and I worked together, you have a
Yep.
closet here in the back.
Yeah, absolutely.
Remember at one point you had a server in your office. Do you
I
remember
did.
that?
I did.
Yeah.
Yep. I remember. So
So,
speaking of that, I do have some servers at my house as well,
okay.
and I use them for testing purposes because sometimes a client says, I want to be able to do this, I just don't know what the cost is going to be. So I
Yeah.
take some of their suggestions and I push it onto an i7 or an i9 with a couple of 3090s or 4090s and see is this able to do what needs to be done within a few seconds, or does it take a few minutes, or does it take a lot longer time? And that's going to tell
Yeah.
me that's going to give me a little a little preview of what the cost is going to be if they run it in the cloud. And it's really is helpful to be able to do those kinds of things very quickly. I'm shocked at how fast some of these things are able to be deployed and provide give me the ability to provide those kinds of cost estimates to clients, and they're fairly accurate. So it's awesome that you're getting this machine. Let me know when you get it. I'll come over and check it out.
Oh, yeah. We're going to geek out on that. So I want
Yeah,
to kind of I want to wrap it up for us on this question, just how to think of it, right? If you're a CTO. So we talked about you have embedded systems or embedded platforms with AWS and stuff. You're kind of all in, and that's if you're just getting started, it's probably your least path of least resistance. Just go with the existing stack. And then the next level would be that separate portable stack where you're starting to differentiate. And it could be cloud-based, where you're using a different cloud service for hosting agents or models, whatever, but it could also be on-prem. And I think that's kind of the next level is the on-prem part, because you're something, again, rule of thumb, if you don't have a strong platform team, you don't have a separate stack. What you have is a risk.
yep,
So
absolutely.
that to me is like a very clear line that I always want to keep in mind. All right, so we covered a couple of topics. The last one I want to really dive into is just going from prototype to production, right? Because that
Mhm.
last few weeks, myself, we've been traveling, we've been on panels, talking to different people and stuff, and it's still I'm surprised, but also not just because we hear it so much, that it's still a challenge for companies to get that prototype into production. So what worked in the demo, fails in production because the system was never really designed to operate in that production environment. And that's, I want to say 90% of the time, the reason why, when we start talking and finding out why things failed, why it couldn't get past that prototype. So do you have some thoughts around that?
Yeah. Actually, I had a couple of clients that I spoke with yesterday and the day before, and they had that exact question. We tried something, it worked once, but how do we get it to work reliably all the time in production? And
Yeah.
my opinion is that getting something to work once is kind of easy, especially with vibe coding and some of the other amazing tools that are coming out there, and every day they're getting better and better. But the real challenge is not that. I think the real challenge is making it consistently work under different conditions than what a developer usually works. It's the same adage of, back in the IBM days, I was writing device drivers, and one of the printer guys came over and said, "Hey, what's the problem?" I said, "Well, the printer driver doesn't work." He's like, "Well, it works on my machine." Well, that's great that it
Mm.
works on your machine, but it doesn't work in everyone's machine. So same thing
Yeah.
here, right? Making it work consistently under different conditions. And I think that's where, I don't know if this is the right term, but reliability engineering, that's where it comes
Mm.
in, right? And a lot of people, they underestimate the effort that's required to deal with this problem. They think that they're just going to develop the code. It looks like it works, so now it's ready to go to production. And then all of a sudden, all kinds of crazy things happen when it's in production. People type in letters instead of numbers in the credit card field. People do all kinds of things that you didn't think about, and edge cases and those kinds of things. And that's where good engineering practices come in handy. And over time, AI will accommodate for those things. But I think it's still a little too early in the process to just say, "Oh, let's just throw our hands in the air and say, here, AI, take care of this for me." There's still a lot of work that needs to be done by real humans and real engineers before AI
Yeah.
can reliably do it.
Yeah, I I think you nailed it with the engineering side of it. So I'm going to take the other side and kind of complete that
Mhm.
picture, right? From
Please do.
from a data science point of view, there's a couple of failure modes, right? That happens with AI specific projects. One is that the problem definition is wrong. It's just the assumptions that you had is wrong. You could have data leakage, or the pipeline is inconsistent. You were talking about that. That's more on the engineering side, but
Mhm.
what people forget is that ETL for my data warehouse, that pipeline is not the same as when I create an ETL or a data pipeline for a model. The reason I say that is if I create a model, a development model, right? I'm training a model, I'm transforming the data, I'm merging. Let's say there's two fields and I make it one field because my AI model expects that one field. There's all kinds of stuff that I do with the data that I would never do if I'm reporting on it, for Wall Street or whatever. So those pipelines very often there's things that go wrong with it. Model quality, we all kind of, have seen this with hallucinations in ChatGPT. Monitoring, observation, and this is interesting. I was talking to somebody yesterday, and they're like, "I like observability," and I've heard that so many times, but it really clicked to me yesterday what he meant with it. He was like, "I don't want to monitor stuff. I want to observe it." I'm like, and the difference is, and he's like, when I observe it, I can see the whole time, what it's doing, not just when it fails. I'm like,
Yep.
gotcha. I like that. So
Absolutely.
that
Absolutely.
is, it's critical, right? And then the also important, like when you have a model, how do you roll it back? What's the strategy to roll it back if it goes wrong? The
Yep.
governance around it. And those are some of the areas that I've seen where it fails. And the other thing is models don't fail like a web page where it's a 500 or a 400 or whatever. That's not typically where models fail.
Hmm.
What fails is in its predictions. So you might ask it a question and it gives you the wrong answer, or it does the wrong prediction. And unless you have some monitoring guardrails, something in place, you're not going to figure out that there's model drift, there's latency, or there's data drift, or something involved there.
Yep.
So
Absolutely.
those are some of the things that upfront nobody really thinks about it. It's just you want to see that it's cool and you have a working model, but a working model is not ready for production necessarily. That's the thing. All of the other things that go around, the monitoring, governance, all of the things that I mentioned, that needs to be part of it.
I agree.
The other thing I've also seen companies that do really well getting AI into production treat it, when it comes to deployment, the same way they treat their software, where there's a development server environment, there's a staging server environment, there's a production or pre-staging or pre-production or whatever. They have multiple environments where they can test it.
Hmm.
And the first time I implemented this for a client, I think it was in Azure, they wanted to move all of the notebooks and things that we used to create the models into all those environments. Like, hold on, the only thing needs to really go is the model. That's the product. And they were doing code reviews on the Python script that's training the model. I'm like, we can do that, but that code is not going to run in production. It's the model that gets generated that's going to run in production. So knowing the nuances of what those environments look like is super important. But if you don't know about it up front, you're probably going to take your Jupyter notebook and everything and move it to the next environment. And your security team is going to say, hold on, you're not moving
Exactly.
this in development or production. There's all kinds of craziness here. And
Exactly.
historically, I'll consider myself, I'll put the data science hat on. Data scientists aren't the best coders,
Yep.
not the greatest. They're good with math and statistics,
For
and I'm
sure.
general. But that's what they do well, is doing a model. So when you move that model, you need somebody that's an expert at engineering, security, governance, all the other things that goes along.
That's right. So, Johan, I'm looking at the timer right now. We've got only 15 minutes left.
Yeah.
Why don't we start taking some questions? I noticed there's a gentleman named Basak, and you were just talking about models, and he's asking, as LLMs are getting smarter and smarter, do we need millions of data to train? Um, so that's the question. So let me try at it, and then if you can
Yeah.
follow up with that, that'd be great. So I think that we don't necessarily need millions of data points anymore in the same way that we used to. Um, it was kind of true in the pre-LLM world. Today we have models like GPT and Claude, and you know, you're already starting with something that's already been trained on massive data sets already. So the game really shifted, I think, so far is, how much data do you have from that question to how well can you use the data that you do have? And I think what's more important is the data quality and the context and not the volume, right? You want to make sure that you can get 80 to 90% of the value by using models in your own data. You obviously have to fine tune things and all the other tasks that typically need to be done. But I think that LLMs are becoming much better at deterministic things, but they're obviously not true deterministic systems, right? So you still need to combine LLMs with traditional systems rather than potentially replacing them all. So I think that LLM, especially the big ones, they reduce the need for massive training data, but they
Mm.
also need to increase the need for a good system design. So it's not about just training the models, but more about orchestrating them correctly.
I agree.
And that's where the advantage really is. That's at least my opinion. So Basak, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, let me see. So getting smarter, we need millions of data to train. So
Mm,
so there's a concept in machine learning separate from language models and the ones that everybody's familiar with these days. It's called transfer learning, right? And if you go and look at like neural networks from 15 years ago, 10 years ago, around the time it started getting popular, Meta came out with a lot of models, a lot of neural network models and stuff. Google came out of a bunch, and they were trained on open data sets, right? They were trained, and let's talk about computer vision for a second. They were trained to recognize a cat. However, if you go and analyze what a neural network actually does, all those layers, they don't know what a cat is. What they know is the features of a cat. So every layer captures like, a different piece of that picture that makes up a cat, the ear shape, the color, things like that. Once you train the neural network, at the end, you give all those features a label that happens to be cat, but you can give it any label. That's why when people say AI understands, I'm very skeptical. I'm very skeptical. It labels stuff and it labels it based on what we want it to label. But different philosophy question around there. But let's say that neural network was trained on recognizing cats. If you now show it a picture of dogs, it's going to do its best guess. And if a dog kind of looks like a cat, it's going to say, yeah, it's a cat. Because it was not trained on dogs. There's no label for dogs. So when you differentiate and you train it on dogs, a different set of features now becomes a grouping for dog, and you label it and it's dog. And now that one model can differentiate between a dog and a cat. The fact that I use that model that's trained on that, and then I train a third, let's say I'm training it on rabbits, that concept is called transfer learning. And instead of me having to go spend millions of dollars to label data and train it and all that stuff, I can use those existing models that knows about the shapes, and it might only need 20% of new types of shapes or features, let's call it features, for recognizing a rabbit, longer ears or something.
mhm.
So my training set becomes smaller because I'm using a model that's already been trained. It's
Yeah.
the same concept with language models. I just didn't want to use that as an example because this concept has been around for a long time. So
Mhm.
that I hope that adds a little bit to it. And then I'm just going to jump to another question that I see.
Yeah, go ahead.
Brendan, you have three questions. I'm going to pick one just because the second one you have observability in agentic systems. That's a whole discussion by itself. So I'm going to,
Oh,
if
yeah.
you want to, and I'll gladly discuss that. But the third question is, I've leveraged AI for a ton of writing code, but it's currently limited, and the code is not something I saw much value on besides POCs. Thoughts? Okay, so I'm going to tell you, we work with a lot of clients that uses AI for production. They generate code. However, what they're not doing is vibe coding. They're not doing that. We actually, one of the things that we started doing a lot of this year, which I never anticipated, is we train engineers how to use Claude Code. We have 12 training sessions. First 6 is teaching the engineering team how to use Claude Code with a workflow. We have a start session, end session that's integrated with MCPs, all stuff. We have a GitHub repo with Claude plugin that they install in their own GitHub so that we don't have to, worry about permissions and all that. And we train the engineers how to use it to produce valuable code and not, AI slop. It continues. We have another 6 lessons that we added because the product owners and the project managers started asking, how can we leverage these tools? in that same workflow. So my point in explaining that is that these tools are great, but where the flaw lies is with the humans. We don't know how to prompt these things. One of the things we did today, actually, like an hour ago, our internal company has training on using Claude Code as well, where we focused on prompting. How do you prompt properly? And we have a repository of prompts, and we have a repository of skills that we're starting to build up, so that once we perfect a prompt, we can share it with everybody and anybody in the company, and they learn how to do that. So I really, if you ask me last year, maybe I would have given you a little bit more credit saying that it's not valuable. Today, it is valuable. You just have to have a good process around that.
Yep. Yeah, let me add a little bit more to that.
Yeah,
I think, I think that this is regarding his question about what was he asking?
just the AI, like
Yeah,
AI coding.
yeah, for coding, right? So I think that right now, and again, this is all about things that are today, and they're not going to be the same 6 months from now or a year from now. These things are moving so quickly, it's difficult to definitively say something and have that statement be hold true for a long period of time. But what you're seeing regarding Brennan, what you're seeing is exactly where the industry is at the moment. So AI is, I think, incredibly amazing at getting you from zero to something, but I don't think it's consistent at getting you from something to production. And the
Yeah,
reason is because,
that
in my
point.
opinion, I think AI doesn't truly understand the entire system that it's building. Remember
Mhm.
how it's able to generate the code. It's looking at patterns. It looked at GitHub repositories. It looked at Reddit comments. It looked at a bunch of other things, and it uses these patterns that it's seen, but it's not based on a deep understanding of your particular architecture or your
Yeah,
particular set of constraints that you have or the goals that you want to have out of your system. So you end up with code that kind of works, but it works in isolation, and it may not work when you orchestrate it with a whole bunch of other things. And I think that's why it feels useful in some ways and less valuable as you get deeper into the problem. Now,
yeah,
in areas where I think it can be useful, at least today. Again, this is something that I'm saying based on today, not what it's going to happen 6 months from now, 3 months from now, 9 months from now, whatever. But you can use AI to go faster. You can use AI to explore various options very quickly. You can eliminate repetitive work. You can do all those kinds of things in a very easy way that you don't have to write a whole bunch of code to test some idea or some concept. Otherwise, you have to have a whole separate team that will do something like that. So it is, it is able to generate code, but designing is a whole other story. I don't think it's
yeah,
there yet, but it's quickly evolving. And over the next months or years or even shorter, it may get to a point where it's able to do that well as well. And that's where, a whole bunch of other things are going to start happening. So, the value of it is shifting, but I think that there's some good capabilities there. I think it will get you 60 to 70% where you need to go, but that last 30 to 40%, that's what actually matters in production. And that's where it requires some serious engineering talent. And that's where people like Johan and I can come in and help. But the gap will shrink over time, but I don't think we're there yet. But it's
yeah.
getting there.
And it's interesting you're saying in the next few months, right? Things have
Yeah.
sped up so much, and it kind of there's somebody that asked a question I want to quickly jump on. It's a quick answer, and then I'll go to another one. So somebody was asking about estimation, right? With all these tools and things like that, how do you get better at estimating? Because should we give better due dates because the old generation targets are not value or needed anymore? Here's the thing: if it took us 6 weeks before to estimate doing a task, I would still estimate 6 weeks. And the reason I say that is a measure of success using AI tools should not be that I'm moving faster. That's one of the byproducts, but it's not the focus. If people think that's the focus, I think it's the wrong measurement. The focus should be you should be able to get better at what you're doing, meaning quality improves. Um, you're getting better at writing unit tests. You're getting better at security and safety and things like that. That is where the measurement should be with these AI tools. Not are we moving faster? If that's the only measure or that's the main measure, you're going to be disappointed. And then it kind of leads into the other question from Leon. He's asking, can you expand on business risk of over reliance on AI tools provided by well-known companies? At what point does this become electricity where the company can't live without it, even when the prices go up? Absolutely, Leon. So I'm going to tell you, and I've probably said this maybe in our previous seminar, I always tell people this example. When Elon Musk bought Twitter and they changed it to X, one of the first things that they did is they increased the price. I don't know if it was free. I think it was free before to access the API for Twitter. And there's a lot of companies, a lot of startups that were profitable that had these scheduling apps. So you can schedule your tweets, right? They all went out of business because they couldn't afford $42,000 a month. And I don't know if it's still that, but it was when they just took over. So huge risk, right? You need to know when you're building these platforms, what is your strategy? Just like if you build software, forget about AI for a second, right? If you build software in AWS and you know there's a risk that AWS could go away, increase prices, whatever, because there's not competition or whatever the reason might be, if you're the architect or the CTO, at some point, somebody needs to own that risk mitigation. How do we exit if we need to? How do we migrate when we need to? Now, if you ask for specific examples, I don't know all of the use cases out there that you might be thinking of, but I'll give you a few. One is model lock-in, right? For the most part today, most of the models are going to perform pretty similar if you use them for business use cases and you're not going deep into one of the model's specific features. And what I mean with that is the prompts that you use, right? The tools that you use. Those are the things that really make the solution valuable. The model itself, think of that as the horsepower that understands the prompts and executes. If you separate the model logic from the model execution in that way, it's very easy to plug in OpenAI, Anthropic, open source, if, like Gemini, not Gemini, is it Gemini? I can't remember now. Gamma I think Gamma 4 just came out from Google, which is open source. Anyway, the point is that you need to build your system from the beginning with that in mind, right? When you build agents or you build any kind of solution around it. But it's the same. I'll give you an example from before LLMs. We used to build computer vision models that do classification, and it looks at an image or a video and it captures the image from the video and it will classify the different objects that we labeled and we trained the model with. So we have a neural network, everything is working well. Then a new architecture came out and we're like, man, now we have to port everything over. And it was a lesson learned. How do we abstract the solution so that we don't have that? And the problem that we had is one model did region of interest, ROI, which is basically where in an image an object exists. It doesn't know what it is. It just knows that this is on the pixels. This is the X, Y coordinates, right? We combined that with the label of that area is a dog or a cat or whatever. By combining it in one model, when a new model came out, we couldn't use that model anymore. We had to create something new. And when we did, we created two models. And in data science, machine learning, there's this concept of ensemble models, ensemble like an orchestra. You never, ever in a production system see one model that solves the whole problem. It doesn't happen. Even if you're chatting with ChatGPT behind the scenes, it's calling different types of models behind the scenes. Ones that's really good at generating images, one that's good at math. So my point with that is that when you structure it, and this is Alex and I going back when we were doing just software development, it's inheritance versus composition. It's a fundamental software problem, right? When you build models, compose. Don't inherit if you don't need to. All right. I hope that answers the question.
Johan, I'm just looking at the time. I think we're out of time. So I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank our host. I'd like to thank everyone for coming here and listening to us talk about this. It's been an awesome conversation. We're going to do it again in the next few weeks. Please, and thank you for all the attendees that came and asked us questions. We tried to answer as many as we could in the time, but please, if you have any other questions, please reach out to either of us. We'd be more than happy to do our best in answering. So thank you everyone for coming, and looking forward to talking with all of you again in the next few weeks. So have a great
Great.
rest of the day and rest of the week.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.